to abate the force of these considerations. An enemy of free discussion may be supposed to say that there is no necessity for mankind in general to know and understand all that can be said against or for the opinions by philosophers and the theologians. It is not needful for common men to be able to expose all the misstatements or fallacies of an ingenious opponent. That is enough if there is always somebody capable of answering them, so that nothing likely to mislead uninstructed persons remains unrefuted. That simple minds, having been taught the obvious grounds of the truth is inculcated on them, mean trust to authority for the rest, and being aware that they have neither knowledge nor talent to resolve every difficulty which can be raised, may repose in the assurance that all those which have been raised have been or can be answered by those who are specially trained to the task. Considering to this view of the subject the utmost that can be claimed for it by those mostly easily satisfied with the amount of understanding of truth which ought to accompany the belief of it, even so, the argument of a free discussion is in no way weakened. For even this doctrine acknowledges that mankind ought to have a rational assurance that all objections have been satisfactorily answered, and how are they to be answered if that which required to be answered is not spoken? Or how can the answer be known to be satisfactory if the objectors have no opportunity of showing that it is unsatisfactory? If not the public, at least the philosophers, the theologians who are to resolve the difficulties, must make themselves familiar with those difficulties in the most puzzling form, and this cannot be accomplished unless they are freely stated and placed in the most advantageous light which they admit of it. The Catholic Church has its own way of dealing with this embarrassing problem. It makes a broad separation between those who can be permitted to receive its doctrines on conviction and those who must accept them on trust. Neither, indeed, are allowed any choice as to what they will accept, but the clergy, such at least as can be fully confided in, may admissibly and meritoriously make themselves acquainted with the arguments of opponents in order to answer them, and may, therefore, read heretical books. The laity, not unless by special permission, hard to be obtained. This discipline recognizes the knowledge of the enemy's case as beneficial to the teachers, but finds means, consistent with this, of denying it to the rest of the world, thus giving to the elite more mental culture, do not more mental freedom, than it allowed to the mass. By this device, it sees in obtaining the kind of mental superiority which its purposes require. Although culture without freedom never made a large and liberal mind, it can make a clever nisi-prois advocate of a cause. But in countries professing Protestantism, this resource is denied. Thus the Protestants hold, at least in theory, that the responsibility for the choice of a religion must be borne by each for himself, and cannot be thrown off upon teachers. Besides, in the present state of the world, it is practically impossible that writings which are read by the instructed can be kept from the uninstructed. The teachers of mankind are to be cognizant of all that they ought to know. Everything must be free to be written and published without restraint. If, however, the mischievous operation of the absence of free discussion, when the received opinions are true, were confined to living men ignorant of the grounds of those opinions, it might be thought that if an intellectual is no moral evil and does not affect the worth of the opinions regarded in their influence on the character. The fact, however, is that not only the grounds of the opinion are forgotten in the absence of a discussion, but too often the meaning of the opinion itself. The words which convey it cease to possess ideas, or possess only a small portion of those who were originally employed to communicate. Instead of vivid conception and living belief, there remain only a few phrases retained by rote, or, if any part of the shell and the husk only of the meaning is retained, the final essence being lost. Great chapter in human history which this fact occupying the field cannot be too earnestly studied and meditated on. Similarly, is the experience of almost all ethical doctrines and religious creeds. They all fall of meaning and vitality to those who originated them, and to the direct disciples of the originators, their meaning continues to be felt in undiminished strength, and its purpose brought out into even fuller consciousness so long as the struggle lasts to give the doctrine or creed ascendancy over other creeds. At last, it either prevails and becomes the general opinion, or its progress stops. It keeps possession of the ground it has gained, but ceases to spread further. When either of these results has become apparent, controversy on the subject flags and gradually dies away. The doctrine has taken place, if not as a received opinion, as one of the immediate sets or divisions of opinion. Those who hold it have generally inherited not adopted it, and the conversion from one of these doctrines to another, being now an exceptional fact, occupies little place in the thoughts of the professors. Instead of being, as at first, constantly on the alert either to defend themselves against the world or to bring the world over to them, they have subsided into acquiescence, and need a lesson, when they can help it, to arguments against their creed. No trouble dissentients, if there be such, with arguments in its favor. From this time may usually be dated the decline in the living power of the doctrine. We often hear the teachers we often hear the teachers of all creeds lamenting the difficulty of keeping up in the minds of believers a lively apprehension of the truth, which is normally recognized, so that it may penetrate the feelings and acquire a real mastery over its conduct. No such difficulty is complained, for while the creed is still fighting for existence, even the weaker combatants then know and feel what they are fighting for, and the difference between it and other doctrines. In that period of every creed's existence, not a few persons may be found who have realized its fundamental principles in all the forms of thought, have weighed and considered them in all the important bearings, and have experienced the full effect on the character, which belief in that creed might ought to produce in the mind thoroughly imbued with it. But when it has come to be a hereditary creed, and not to be received passively, not actively, when the mind is no longer compelled in the same degree as at first to exercise vital powers on the questions which its belief presents to it, there is a progressive tendency to forget all of the beliefs except the formularies, or to give it a dull and torpid assent, as if accepting it on trust dispensed with the necessity of realizing it in consciousness or testing it by personal experience, until it almost ceases to connect itself at all with the inner life of the human being. That I seeing the cases so frequent in this age of the world as almost to form the majority, in which the creed remains, as it were, outside the mind, encrusting and petrifying it against all other influences addressed to the higher parts of our nature, manifesting its power by not suffering any fresh living conviction to get in, but itself doing nothing for the mind or heart except standing sentinel over them to keep them vacant. To what extent doctrines intrinsically fitted to make the deepest impression upon the mind may remain innate as dead beliefs without being realized in the imagination, the feelings, or the understanding is exemplified by the manner in which the majority believers hold the doctrine of Christianity. By Christianity, I here mean what is accounted such as by all churches or sects, the maxims, the precepts contained in the New Testament. These are considered sacred and accepted as laws by all professing Christians. It is scarcely too much to say that not one Christian in 1,000 guides or tests his individual conduct by reference to those laws. The standard to which he does refer it is the custom of his nation, his class, or his religious profession. He has thus, on the one hand, a collection of ethical maxims which he believed to have been vouchsafed to him by infallible wisdom as rules for his government, and on the other, a set of everyday judgments and practices which go a certain length with some of those maxims, not so great a length with others, stand in direct opposition to some, and are, on the whole, a compromise between the Christian creed and the interests and suggestions of a worldly life. To the first of this standard he gives his homage, to the other his real allegiance. All Christian believes that the blessed are the poor and humble, and those who are ill-used by the world. That it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. That they should judge not, lest they be judged. That they should swear not at all. That they should allow their neighbor as themselves. That if one take their cloak, they should give him their coat. Also, that they should take no thought for the morrow. That if they would be perfect, they should sell all that they have and give to the poor. They are not insincere when they say that they believe these things. They do believe them, as people believe what they have already heard, lauded, and never discussed. But in the sense of that living belief, which regulates conduct, they believe these doctrines just up to the point to which it is usual to act upon them. The doctrines in their integrity are serviceable to pelt adversaries with. It is understood that they are to be put forward, when possible, as the reasons for whatever people do that they think laudable. By anyone who reminds them that the maxims require an infinity of things which they never even think of doing, would gain nothing but to be classed among those very unpopular characters who affect to be better than other people. The doctrines have not hold on ordinary believers, are not a power in their minds. They have a habitual respect for the sound of them, but no feeling which spreads from the words to the things signified, and forces the mind to take them in, and make them conform to the formula. Whatever conduct is concerned, they look around for Mr. A and B to direct them how far to go in obeying Christ. Now, we may be well sure that the case was not thus, but far otherwise with the early Christians. Had it been thus, Christianity never would have expanded from obscure sect of the despised Hebrews into the religion of the Roman Empire. When their enemies said, "See how these Christians love one another," a remark not likely to be made by anybody now. They assuredly had a much livelier feeling of the meaning of their creed than they ever had since. And to this cause, probably it is chiefly owing that Christianity now makes so little progress in extending its dominion, and after 18 centuries is still nearly confined to Europeans and descendants of Europeans, even with strictly religious, who much in earnest about the doctrines. It attach a great amount of meaning to many of them than people in general. It commonly happens that the part which is thus comparatively active in their minds is that which was made by Calvin or Knox or some other such a person much nearer in character to themselves. The sayings of Christ coexist passively in their minds, producing hardly any effect beyond what is caused by mere listening to words so amiable and bland. There are many reasons, doubtless, why doctrines which are the badge of a sect retain some more of their vitality than those common to all recognized sects, and why more pains are taken by teachers to keep their meaning alive. But one reason certainly is that the peculiar doctrines are more questioned, and have to be oftener defended against open gazers. Both teachers and learners go to sleep under post as soon as there is no enemy in the field. The same thing holds true, generally speaking, of all traditional doctrines, those of prudence and knowledge of life, as well as for morals or religion. All languages and literatures are full of general observations on life, both as to what it is and how to conduct oneself in it. Observation which everybody knows, which everybody repeats or hears with acquiescence, which are received as truisms, yet of which most people first truly learn the meaning when experience, generally of a painful kind, had made it a reality to them. How often, when smarting under some unforeseen misfortune or disappointment, does a person call to mind some proverbs or common saying familiar to him all his life, the meaning of which, if he had ever before felt it as he does now, would have saved him from the calamity. There are indeed reasons for this, other than the absence of discussion, the many truths which the full meaning cannot be realized until personal experience has brought it home. But much more of the meaning, even of this, would have been understood, and what was understood would have been far more deeply impressed on the mind if the man had been accustomed to hear it argued, proved, and come by people who did understand it. The fatal tendency of mankind to leave off thinking about the thing when it is no longer doubtful is the cause of half the errors. A contemporary author has well spoken of the deep slumber of a decided opinion. But what, it may be asked, is the absence of unanimity in indispensable condition of true knowledge? Is it necessary some part of mankind should persist in error to enable any to realize the truth? Does a belief cease to be real and vital as soon as it is generally received? It is a proposition never thoroughly understood or felt unless some doubt of it remains. As soon as mankind have unanimously accepted truth, that the truth perish within them, the highest aim, the best result, the improved intelligence. It has heretofore been sought. It will unite mankind more and more in the acknowledgement of all important truths, and does intelligence only last long as it has not achieved its object? Do the fruits of conquest perish by the very completeness of the victory? I affirm no such a thing. As mankind improve, the number of doctrines which are no longer disputed or doubted will be constantly on the increase. The well-being of mankind may almost be measured by the number and the gravity of the truths which have reached the point of being uncontested. The sensation, on one question after another, of a serious controversy is one of the necessary incidents of the consolidation of opinion. A consolidation as a salutary in the case of true opinions, it is dangerous and nauseous when the opinions are erroneous. But though this gradual narrowing the bounds of diversity of opinion is necessary in both senses of the term, being at once inevitable and indispensable, we are not therefore obliged to conclude that all its consequences must be beneficial. The loss of so important an aid to the intelligent and living apprehension of the truth, and is afforded by the necessity of explaining it to or defending it against opponents, though not sufficient to our whim, is no trifling drawback from the benefits of its universal recognition. Whereas its disadvantage can no longer be had, I confess I should like to see the teachers of mankind endeavoring to provide a substitute for it, some contrivance for making the difficulties of the question as a present to the learner's consciousness, as if they were pressed upon him by a dissentient champion eager for his conversion. But instead of seeking contrivances for this purpose, they have lost those they formerly had. The Socratic dialectics, so magnificently exemplified in the dialogues of Plato, were a contrivance of this description. They were essentially an negative discussion of the great questions of philosophy and of our life, directed with consummated skill to the purpose of convincing anyone that he merely adopted the commonplaces of received opinion, that he did not understand the subject, that he as yet attached to no definite meaning to the doctrines he professed, in order that, becoming aware of his ignorance, he might be put in the way to attain a stable belief, resting on a clear apprehension both of the meaning of doctrines and of their evidence. The school disputations of the Middle Ages had a somewhat similar object. They were intended to make sure that the pupil understood his own opinion, and by necessary correlation, the opinion opposed to it, and could enforce grounds for the one and confute those of the other. This last mentioned contest had indeed the incurable defect that the premises appealed to were taken from authority, not from reason, and as displaying to the mind, they were in every respect inferior to the powerful didactics which formed the intellect of the Socratic weary. But the modern mind owns far more to both than it is generally willing to admit, and the present modes of education contain nothing which in the small degree supplies the place either of the one or the other, all of the other. A person who derives all his instruction from teachers, all books, even if escape the besetting temptation of contenting himself with a crab, is under no compulsion to hear both sides. Accordingly, it is far from a frequent accomplishment, even among thinkers who know both sides. And the weakest part of what everybody says in defense of his opinion is what intends as reply to agonists. It is the fashion of the present time to disparage negative logic, that which points out weaknesses in theory or errors in practice, without establishing positive truths. Such negative criticism would indeed be poor enough as an ultimate result, but as a means to attaining any positive knowledge or conviction worthy the same. It cannot be valued too highly, And until people are again systematically trained to it, there will be few great thinkers at a low general average of intellect in any but the mathematical and physical departments of speculation. Or any other subject, no one's opinion deserves the name of knowledge, except so far as he has either and forced upon him by others, or gone through of himself the same mental process which would have been required of him in carrying on an active controversy with opponents. That, therefore, which when absent is when absent, it is so indispensable, but so difficult to create, or worse than absurd is it to forego when spontaneously offering the self. If there be any persons who contest a received opinion, or who will do so if law opinion will let them, let us thank them for it, open our mind to listen to them, and rejoice that there is someone to do for us what we otherwise ought, if we have any regard for either the certainty or the vitality of our convictions, to do with much greater labor for ourselves. It still remains to speak of one of the principal causes which make diversity of opinion advantageous, and it will continue to do so until mankind shall have entered the stage of intellectual advancement which at present seems at an incalculable distance. We have heretofore considered only two possibilities. The received opinion may be false, and some other opinion consequently true, or that the received opinion being true, a conflict with the opposite error is essential to a clear apprehension and deep feeling of its truth. But there is a commoner case than either of these. When the conflicting doctrines, instead of being one true and the other false, share the truth between them, that the non-conforming opinions needed to supply the remainder of the truth, of which received doctrine embodies only a part. Popular opinions or subjects not palpable to sense are often true, but seldom or never the whole truth. They are a part of the truth. Sometimes a greater, sometimes a smaller part, but exaggerated, distorted, and disjoined from the truths by which they ought to be accompanied and limited. Heretical opinions, on the other hand, are generally some of these suppressed and neglected truths, bursting the bonds which keep them dumb, and either seeking reconciliation with the truth contained in the common opinion, or fronting it as enemies and setting themselves up with a similar exclusiveness and the whole truth. The latter case is heretofore the most frequent, as in the human mind one-sidedness has always been the rule, and many-sidedness the exception. Hence, even in revolutions of opinion, one part of the truth usually sets while another rises. Even progress, which ought to be superend, for the most part, only substitutes one partial and incomplete truth for another, improvement consisting chiefly in this, that the new fragment of truth is more wanted, more adapted to the needs of the time, than that which it displaces. Such being the partial character for prevailing opinions, even when resting on a true foundation, every opinion which embodies somewhat the portion of truth which the common opinion omits ought to be considered, precious with what amount of error and confusion that truth may be blended. No sober judge of human affairs will feel bound to be indignant because those who force on our noted truths which we should otherwise have overlooked some of those which we see. Rather, he will think that so long as popular truth is one-sided, it is more desirable than otherwise that unpopular truth should have one-sided asserters too, such being usually the most energetic and the most likely to compel reluctant attention to the fragment of wisdom which they proclaim as if it were the whole. Thus, in the 18th century, when nearly all the instructed and all those of the uninstructed who were led by them were lost in admiration of what is called civilization and for the marvels of modern science, literature, and philosophy, while greatly overrating the amount of unlikeness between men of modern and those of ancient times, he indulged the belief that the whole of the difference was in their own favor, was what a solitary shock did the paradoxes of Rousseau explode like bombshells in the mist, dislocating the compact mass of one-sided opinion and forcing its elements to recombine in a better form and with additional ingredients. Not that the current opinions were on the whole further from the truth than Rousseau's were. On the contrary, they were nearer to it. They contained more of a positive truth and were very less of error. Nevertheless, there lay in Rousseau's doctrine, and had floated down the stream of opinion along with it, a considerable amount of exactly those truths which the popular opinion wanted, and these are the deposit which were left behind when the flood subsided. The superior worth of simplicity for life, the enervating and demoralizing effect of the tremors and hypocrisies of artificial society are ideas which have never been entirely absent from a cultivated mind since Rousseau wrote, and they will in time produce their due effect, though at present needing to be asserted as such as ever, and to be asserted by deeds or words on this subject has nearly exhausted their power. In politics, again, it is almost a commonplace that a party for order or stability and a party for progress or reform are both necessary elements of a healthy state of political life, until the one or the other shall have so enlarged its mental grasp and to be a party equally for order and for progress, knowing and distinguishing what is fit to be preserved from what ought to be swept away. Each of those modes of thinking derives the utility from the deficiencies of the other, but is in great measure the opposition of the other that it keeps each within the limits of reason and sanity. Unless opinions favorable to democracy and to aristocracy, to property and equality, to cooperation and to competition, to luxury and to abstinence, to sociality, individuality, to liberty and discipline, and all the understanding antagonisms of practical life are expressed with equal freedom and enforced and defended with equal talents and energy. There's no chance of both elements obtaining the due. One skill is sure to go up and the other down. Truth, in the great practical concerns of life, is so much a question of the reconciling and combining for opposites that the very few have minds sufficiently capacious and impartial to make the adjustment with approach to correctness, and it has to be made by the raw process of a struggle between combatants fighting under hostile banners. On any of the great open questions just enumerated, For each of the two opinions has a better claim than the other, not merely to be tolerated, but to be encouraged and countenanced. It is the one which happens at the particular time, the place, to be in a minority. That is the opinion which, for the time being, represents the neglected interests, the side of human well-being which is in danger of obtaining less than it is a share. I'm aware that there is not, in this country, any intolerance for differences of opinion on most of these topics. That are used to show by immediately multiplied examples the universality of the fact that only through diversity of opinion is there, in the existing state of human intellect, a chance of a fair play to all sides of the truth. When there are persons to be found who form exception to the apparent unanimity of the world, on any subject, even if the world is in the right, it's always probable that the dissentients have something worth hearing to say for themselves, and that truth would lose something by their silence. It may be objected by some received principles, especially on the highest and most vital subjects, are more than half truths. The Christian morality, for instance, is a whole truth on that subject. If anyone teaches a morality which varies from it, he is wholly in error. And this is of all cases most important in practice. None can be fitter to test the general maxim. But before pronouncing what Christian morality is or is not, it would be desirable to decide what is meant by Christian morality. If it means the morality of the New Testament, I wonder that anyone who derives his knowledge of this from the book itself can suppose that it was announced or intended as a complete doctrine of morals. The gospel always refers to a pre-existing morality and confines its precepts to the particulars in which that morality was to be corrected or superseded by a wider and higher, expressing itself, moreover, in terms of most general, often impossible to be interpreted literally, and possessing rather the impressiveness of poetry or eloquence than the precision of a legislation. To extract from it the body for ethical doctrine has ever been possible without aching it out from the Old Testament, that is, from a system elaborate indeed, but in many respects barbarous, and intended only for the barbarous people. St. Paul, a declared enemy to this Judaical mode of interpreting the doctrine and filling up the skins of his master, equally assumed the pre-existing morality, namely that of the Greeks and the Romans. It is wise to Christians in a great measure a system of accommodation to that, even to the extent of giving apparent sanction to slavery. What is called Christian, but it should rather be termed theological morality, was not the work of Christ or the apostles, but is of much later origin, having been gradually built up by the Catholic Church of the first 5 centuries, and though not implicitly adopted by moderns and Protestants, have been much less modified by them than might have been expected. For the most part, indeed, they have contented themselves with cutting off the additions which has been made to it in the Middle Ages, its sect supplying the place by fresh additions adapted to its own character and tendencies. That mankind own a great debt to this morality and to its early teachers. I should be the last person to deny, but I do not scruple to say of it and that it is, in many important points, incomplete and one-sided, and that unless ideas or feelings not sanctified it and contributed to the formation of European life, and character, human affairs would have been in a worse condition than they now are. Christian morality, so called, has all the characters of a reaction. It is, in great part, a protest against paganism. Its idea is negative rather than positive, passive rather than active, innocence rather than nobleness, abstinence from evil rather than energetic pursuit of good. Its precepts, as has been well said, thou shalt not, predominates unduly over thou shalt. Its horrorful sensuality made an idol of asceticism, which has been gradually compromised away into one of legality. It holds out the hope of heaven and the threat of hell as the appropriate motive to a virtuous life. It is falling far below the best of the Asians and doing what lies in it to give to human morality an essentially selfish character by disconnecting each man's feelings and duty from the interests of his fellow creatures, except so far as a self-interested inducement is offered to him for consulting them. It is essentially a doctrine of passive obedience. It inculcates submission to all authorities found established, who indeed are not to be actually obeyed when the command or religion forbids, but who are not to be resisted, far less rebelled against for any amount of wrong to ourselves. And whereas in the morality of the best pagan nations, duty to the state holds excuse me, excuse me, holds even disproportion in place, infringing on the just liberty of the individual. In purely Christian ethics, that a grand department of duty is scarcely noticed or acknowledged. It is in the Koran, not the New Testament, that we read the maxim, ruler who appoints any man to office, whether it's in his dominions, another man better qualified for it, sins against God and against the state. What little recognition the idea of obligation to the public obtained in modern morality is derived from Greek and Roman sources, not from Christians. As even in the morality of private life, whatever exists of magnanimity, high-mindedness, personal dignity, even the sense of honor, is derived from the purely human, not the religious part of our education, and never could have grown out of a standard for ethics in which the only worth professedly recognized is that of obedience. I am as far as anyone from pretending that these defects are necessarily inherent in the Christian ethics, in every manner in which it can be conceived, or that the many prerequisites of a complete moral doctrine which it does not contain do not admit of being reconciled with it. Far less would I insinuate this of the doctrines and the precepts of Christ himself. I believe that the sins of Christ are all that I can see any evidences of having been intended to be, and they are irreconcilable with nothing which a comprehensive morality requires. But everything which is excellent in ethics may be brought within them with no greater violence to their language than has been done to it by all who have tended to deduce from them any practical system of conduct whatever. But it is quite consistent with this to believe that were meant to contain only a part of the truth, and the many essential elements of the highest morality are among the things which are not provided for, nor intended to be provided for, in the recorded learnings of the founder of Christianity, and which have been entirely thrown aside in the system of ethics erected on the basis of those deliverance by the Christian Church. And this being so, I think it is a great error to persist in tending to find in the Christian doctrine the complete role for our guidance, which is Arthur intended to sanction and enforce, but only partially to provide, I believe, too, that this narrow theory is becoming a great practical evil, detracting greatly from the value of the moral training and instruction which so many well-meaning persons are now at length exerting themselves to promote. I much fear that by attempting to form the mind, the feelings on an exclusive religious type and discarding those secular standards as for want of a better name they may be called, which heretofore causes with and supplanted the Christian ethics, receiving some of its spirit and infusing into it some of theirs, that will result, even now resulting, a low, abject, servile type of a character, which submits itself as it may to what it deems the supreme will, is incapable of rising to, or sympathizing in the conception of a supreme goodness. I believe that other ethics than any which can be involved from exclusive Christian sources must exist side by side with the Christian ethic to produce the moral regeneration of mankind, and that the Christian system is no exception to the rule, that in an imperfect state of human mind, the interests of truth require a diversity of opinions. It is not necessary that in ceasing to ignore the moral truths not contained in Christianity, man should ignore any of those which it does contain. Such prejudice or oversight, when it occurs, is altogether evil, but is one from which we cannot hope to be always exempt, and must be regarded as a price paid for an estimable good. The exclusive pretension made by a part of the truth to be the whole must and ought to be protested against, and if a reactionary impulse should make the protesters unjust in their term, this one-sidedness, like the other, may be lamented, but it must be tolerated. A Christian would teach infidels to Christianity to be just to Christianity. They should themselves be just to infidelity. It can do truth no service to blink the fact, known to all who have the most ordinary acquaintances with the literary history, that a large portion, noblest and most valuable moral teaching, have been the work not only of a man who did not know, but of a man who knew and rejected the Christian faith. I do not pretend that the most unlimited use of the freedom of enunciating all possible opinions will put an end to the evils of religious or philosophical sectarianism. Every truth which men of a narrow capacity are in earnest about is sure to be asserted, inculcated, and in many ways even acted on as if no other truth exists in the world, and at all events none that could limit or qualify the first. Acknowledge that the tendency for all opinions to become sectarian is not cured by the free discussion, but is often heightened and exasperated thereby. The truth which ought to have been, but was not, seen, being rejected all the more violently because proclaimed by persons regarded as opponents. But it is not on the impassioned partition, it is on the common and more disinterested bystander that this collision of opinions works its salutary effect. Not the violent conflict between parts of the truth, but the quiet suppression of half it, is a formidable evil. There's always hope when people are forced to listen to both sides. It is when they attend only to one that errors harden into prejudices, and truth itself seems to have the effect of truth. by being exaggerated into falsehood. Since there are few mental attributes more rare than the judicial faculty, which can sit in intelligent judgment between two sides of a question, of which only one is represented by an advocate before it. Truth has no chance but in proportion as every side of it, every opinion which embodies any fraction of the truth, not only found advocates, but is so advocated as to be listened to.